First of all, I'm not a fan of government at all. And that came about in the late 80s. I was a sergeant was transferred and assigned to our planning and fiscal section, which ran everything, the business end of the police department. And I found out very quickly that government is very inefficient and very ineffective in how we do things. So since that time, since the late 80s, I have, through the different commands, tried to implement private sector strategies in how we do our business. So this is less about a police department. It's a case study if you want to talk about a police department, more about how we in government, because all of us are in some form of government, can take private sector approaches and make our organizations more efficient and more effective. So that's really what we did. And the caveat in all this, as I said, plagiarism gets you kicked out of NPS, but it's highly encouraged in government service. So we kind of got a little bit of a quandary here. So we stole a lot along the way. So a little bit about Sacramento. 500,000 people. It's a state capital, so our population goes up by about 125,000 during the day. Lesser known facts about us. At the time in 2007, we were the second most violent major city in California, the second highest property crime rate in the state of California for major cities, and we were the worst when it came to accidents and fatalities related to drunk driving. A lot of people had no clue that Sacramento was like that. It was kind of a hidden secret, if you want to, because we didn't talk about it. And lastly, we started in December 2007 when I was offered the job by the city manager. He said, I want to make you the police chief, and by the way, start cutting your budget, because it looks like we're going into a budget problem. We thought would be a one-year problem, turned out to be a 5-year problem. So the way we look at things, if you're a private sector business, and we got together and we said, for a private sector business, is it a problem or is it an opportunity? Most of the command staff said, oh my God, we got a major problem. First, we've had a budget mess for 2 decades. How many of you fund part of your service and supply budgets through vacancies, through salary savings? How many fund overtime? And basically your budget is not aligned accurately. So our budget was not aligned accurately. We had to carry about 50 to 60 vacancies to pay for overtime, to pay for fuel for cars, to pay for replacement of vehicles and equipment. That's how we managed our budget. So then all of a sudden you go into what you think is a budget crisis, we got a problem, right? No, it was an opportunity. Because what's the private sector say? In order to create change, you create a crisis or you create a sense of urgency. We had all of the above. Because in it, we're also one of the lowest staffed major cities in the nation. We had a very hotly contested mayor's race at the time, which led to a lot of political issues because the then sitting mayor wanted me to investigate the challenger, who also happened to be a former NBA All-Star. That made it into the public, so that created a little bit more of the crisis within the organization to change. We had a city manager who was brought in to build high-rises, and instead of building 54-story high-rises, we had empty vacant lots, and he basically just said, I'm not good at budgeting. So that also created an opportunity for us. And then we had a lot of internal politics. Half of the organization was supporting a deputy chief that didn't get promoted. The other half of the organization was supporting me getting promoted. And so right off the bat, I had half the command staff not supporting the direction we were going to go. Again, some opportunities. So philosophically, what we did was I went back to some of the work that we did in post-command college. So California has, the Peace Officer Standard Training has a command college. And it's really futures-oriented. So there's nothing about law enforcement. The 18-month program, very similar to this, there's nothing about law enforcement you study. It's all about the private sector. And I remember very clearly reading, and we read the Challenger, the big book on the Challenger disaster. We read all kinds of different briefings and books and journals. But I remember Westinghouse. Something in Westinghouse's story hit me. And I was reading about the CEO in Westinghouse back in the day who said, if we're not number 1 or number 2 in the market, we stop doing it. We're not going to be third. And we'll stop doing things. Don't grow if you're not going to be the best. So I went in with an attitude that we're going to have 3 goals in the organization, because back then we had none. If you ask the command staff, and I did, what are the goals of the Sacramento Police Department? It went from half the group saying we don't have any to the other half of the group saying what their division or operational area goals were, not what the organizational goals were. So I said, we're going to go to 3. I'm going to steal something off of Westinghouse, but instead of 2, I'll say 3. And also 3 things you can remember. You can't remember. I can't remember a 12-step program. The first step is acknowledging you have a problem. I couldn't tell you what 2 through 12 are because there's too many of them to remember. I also wanted a private sector feel to the organization. The question came up earlier to Barney Malekian, how do you get something done when your procurement process takes 12 to 18 months? Well, if you're in the private sector, and I'll rely on our two two colleagues who just joined the private sector. If it takes you 12 to 18 months to buy something in the private sector, your procurement manager's in the unemployment line. But in government, we tolerate it. So how do we get a results-driven structure in our department versus a process-driven structure? So we're going to go from process to results. And it's something, again, it goes back to the late 80s when I was a sergeant in our fiscal section going, this is just way too much process. You got to fill out this paperwork when we shouldn't have to do these things. And then I wanted to be the best employer in Northern California. My master's at the state level at Sac State was in organizational communication, and my thesis and all my research was on team building and supervisor interpersonal skills. So my bent is that I know that if you can create an environment where the employees love coming to work, they outperform what they would have done if they just come in and punch in the clock. So I wanted to be the best employer in Northern California. What's interesting about that is I was suddenly found out that in Northern California is Nugget Market. How many people have ever been in a Nugget Market? Anyone? Nugget Market at the time was ranked by Forbes magazine as the 5th best employer in the United States. And they're in Northern California. So if we're going to be the best employer in Northern California, we got to beat Nugget Market. So I invited the CEO and COO of Nugget Market to come in and teach us how they became the 5th best employer in the United States. And we stole their strategies. We're not a competitor, so they freely came in and talked to 200 of our employees and told them how they became the best employer. I'll get to that in a second. And then I also had untouchables, the sacred cows. Historically, in law enforcement agencies and in the fire service, I can't speak for the rest of you, but when you have a budget cut, you cut those high-profile items that the city council will never, ever let you cut. We're going to take our primary policing teams away. We're no longer going to do community policing. Well, it's a philosophy, not a program. So we didn't do that. So we had some untouchables. I said, if we don't pick up the 911 line when somebody calls for help and we don't get to them when they're in a crisis, we have failed as a business. The private sector would never fail at their core mission, so we're not going to propose anything that fails at our core mission, so we're not going to cut patrol, and we're not going to cut the 911 center. And again, this is year one. This is the philosophical stuff on what we're told is a 12% cut that goes on for 5 years. And we'll get to that in a second. So, the process. I took the leadership team off-site. Historically, when we took the leadership team off-site, we went to Embassy Suites in Lake Tahoe. We went to places that were to Napa. We went to all the high-profile places. They were fun, right? Because back before I took over the organization, we had 5 years of, oh my God, we got $15 million left in the budget. What are we going to buy? We went from that to suddenly we have to cut. So no longer were we going to be able to go out of town to Embassy Suites, to Lake Tahoe, to Napa Valley. No longer was that possible. So what we did was, one of our captains has family property up at Lake Almanor. Lake Almanor is at about 3,500 feet. It's pine trees, and it's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath home with a bunch of sheds to sleep in above the garage and Granny's house that you have to open up all the windows down by the lake and let the bats fly out of Granny's house. Okay? Everybody pitched in money. City cost the city no money. Everybody pitched in $40. Went to Costco, loaded up with food. It was a BYOB, and we spent 3 days in this remote location that wasn't big enough to house the meeting, so we had to sit under the pine trees. You sit in the sun in the morning, you move to the shade in the afternoon. I had a couple purposes. One, I wanted to not just have it where you had your meetings and everybody ran off to gamble at Lake Tahoe. I wanted it so everybody was around each other all the time, so we actually got to know who we were as an individual. Because what does the private sector do? When you talk to Nugget Market, they take their staff off and they do things together. It's not like let's meet and let's break up. Let's go do things. Again, stealing something from the private sector. What it was also, I had an ulterior motive, because that's where we went to set our goals. I had an ulterior motive that I wanted to find out who really was on the bus with me. You know, we talk about you get the right people on the bus and you put them in the right seats and you get the wrong people off the bus, right? Everybody's heard that. Well, we work for government. You can't get anybody off the bus. They have job rights. We're not the private sector that can fire people because they're not going in the direction we want to go. So I wanted to find out who basically was not on the bus with us, but still physically they're on the bus. And I found out very quickly, because in the day one, we had a rule. Nobody talks to anybody at work, because we're going to talk about some really critical issues in the organization. At the end of the first morning break, we kind of took a break. Everybody refreshed their coffee. I found out from a couple folks that I trusted that, hey, there's people back in Sacramento already finding out what we're talking about. So we came back from the break, sitting in a circle under pine trees. Everybody had to take their cell phones out of their pockets, physically watch, and put them in the center of the circle. I took everybody's cell phones away from them until the end of the afternoon because I still couldn't determine who was on the bus. But we couldn't have information coming back. So I quickly found out that the people that were no longer on the bus with me, I can't get rid of them, right? So I transferred them. I created assignments with nothing to do. Because our organization moved, and it was 50% of the command staff, by the way. 50% of the command staff was transferred into positions that I made up. Because it was easier to move the bus forward and move the organization forward in the crisis that we were in with half the command staff because they were efficient and effective and put the other half in assignments that just they had nothing to do. I termed that later on. I realized, actually, I put them in the paint room. You got assigned to the paint room to watch the paint dry because that was your job. That's all you were allowed to do was watch the paint dry. And then the organization started moving forward. You can't fire somebody who's been there 30 years for just not wanting to kind of move, you know, that the people who are just passive-aggressive, there's no discipline in the process to eliminate somebody from 30 years of service to do that. So they got the paint room, which really helped the organization move forward. And it said we are going to change. Because we asked ourselves all the time, why do we exist as a police department? You fill in the blank for you. Why do we exist as a fire department? Why do we exist as EMS? Whatever your role is, why do you exist? Because there's too much scope creep. We've gone way too far out. So why do we exist? And to help people frame that in our meetings, and again, I'm learning this all from the private sector. I'm stole it all and give them credit. Because you have to ask yourself, the easiest way to do it is if we were starting a brand new business, a brand new police department, then there's no sacred cows. There's none of the way we used to be. If we're starting brand spanking new, how would we do it? So here's what we came up with. Here's our goals, our 3 goals. It started out with we're going to reduce crime. All crime, we're cutting staff. All crime, no, it went down to serious crime because Part 1 crimes, serious crimes. That's what businesses measure before they relocate. That's what people determine whether they're going to move to your city. All this stuff is about, you know, the FBI index. And by the way, the UCR, if you're not familiar with them, we're trying to change that right now. I'm on a committee that's trying to change the UCR because it's 90 years old. It needs to be updated. Then I said, all right, our job is to reduce serious crime. Then who's our greatest asset? It's our employees. We're publicly going to say in our 3 goals, we're going to invest in our people because that's what the private sector does when you're in a business like ours. And lastly, we're going to have great customer service. I didn't call it the community. We called it customers because customer has a different tenor than it does when you're talking about the customer than it does when you're saying we're just going to work with the community because everybody is a customer. And then we went out and started talking to people. And I'll show you, well, let's just move to this now. So we are a high-tech agency. We have more computers than we have people. Every screensaver on every computer in every patrol car, on every dispatch console, on every PC on a desktop, on every laptop that traveled had this on it. Every member of the Sacramento Police Department, I challenge anybody visiting the Capitol to ask anybody in uniform, hey, what's BIG stand for? They can tell you what that is. So we kind of, and I'll go through what the initiatives with bringing down crime and investing in employees. Great customer service was interesting. So I'm hitting all the roll calls. We have 11 different facilities. So I'm in all these different shifts, day shift, graveyard, trying to hit the roll calls to talk about what we're doing. And so I constantly get the officers going, all right, what's great customer service? I don't understand that. I go, that's the easiest of them all. Great customer service is a thank you out of every encounter. If you're a 911 dispatcher, before the person gets off the line, they should say thank you to you. If you're an officer handling a call, taking a report, the person should say thank you. If you're writing a ticket, the person you write the ticket to should say thank you. And believe it or not, I do some of the stuff for the state of California agencies, for different agencies in the state. And one of the ladies, I'm talking to the folks in general services, one of the executives, she raised her hand, she goes, I got to tell you a story. One of your officers stopped me. It's like, oh no, you know, the dreaded, uh-oh. She goes, and I was talking to him, I had to take my son to the PSAT, he's got a PSAT to take, and I blew a red light, and I'm trying to explain how I need to be hurrying. The officer said, don't worry, ma'am, I'll write your ticket very fast. She goes, lo and behold, it was like seconds. He comes back with the ticket. That's the fastest. How do you do that? And I thanked him. She goes, I couldn't believe I thanked him. He was polite, he was courteous, explained what he was doing, and got me back on the road where I needed to go. She goes, I actually thanked him for writing me the ticket. So, how do we do it? How do we bring down Part 1 crime? First thing we did was, everything we're going to do is going to be evidence-based. No longer are we just going to kind of shotgun stuff. It's all going to be evidence-based. And we started looking at how do we do predictive stuff? It's interesting. I'm in a meeting talking to one of the future paint room people that ended up in a paint room. So I'm in our ComStat meeting and said, I want to predict crime. You can't predict crime. You can't predict it. There's no such way you can predict crime. I said, I don't know, I want to give it a try. You can't do it. So obviously this guy's going to the paint room, right? So I asked the question, I ask you this, what's a great batting average in baseball? 300, 333? 333 and you're a rock star, right? You only get it right a third of the time, and you're a rock star. Every offensive play in football is designed to score a touchdown. Their percentage of success is less than that. So if we can predict crime 5% of the time and reduce crime by being smart, using evidence-based things, and get out in front of it, and reduce crime just by being smart 5%, that's what the private sector do, trying to predict who their customers are going to be, trying to predict what the next technology is going to be, trying to always predict what's out there. And if you get it wrong, at least you tried, right? So we did hotspot policing with George Mason University and identified where our randomized patrol could we reduce crime just by randomly being present. And now we're working on a study. They're working on a study. I keep saying we, right? I just retired at the end of December, so I still say we. Actually, I'm a reserve. Remember Barney talked about the retirees being dumped out? I signed up to be a reserve, and I was on the phone last night helping out the organization in the process. But we're trying to pick who now are the offenders, not the locations anymore, but who's most likely to commit crimes. And the Council of State Governments has helped us, Los Angeles Police Department, San Francisco, and Redlands do it. And now we're going to continue the study statewide. So we're over the Capitol trying to predict who are the most likely offenders to target them, because that's what the private sector would do. Employee investment. Having those 3 clear goals made the employees extremely happy because they knew what they were supposed to do. So the IT person internally who's fixing the PCs knows they're supposed to go get a thank you letter every time they go fix somebody's computer. Everybody knew what it was. What it also helped us do was explain budget cuts. When you cut as dramatically as we did, we can say, listen, it was cut because we valued whether does it have a direct impact on one of the 3 goals, support one of the 3 goals, or have nothing to do with one of the 3 goals. It made it very easy to refer back to those 3 things. And that's how we cut our budget in the process. We also I wanted to create a sense of family. Nugget Market, and we brought them in, and they weren't the only ones, I'll get to that in a second, created a sense of family in the organization where everybody felt valued. Government employees, particularly those in public safety, tend to not feel valued. I'm just an ID number. I'm just a badge number. So how do we create family value? So we created the Sacramento Police Department Fitness Club. We created a business. So every employee in the police department is registered with the community college district in a class every semester. We then share some of the average daily attendance money with the community college. We get $4 an hour for every employee that's working out. We then take that money and buy gym equipment, flat panel televisions, the videos, workout videos, and we created our own health club. And by the way, we tried towels, but they disappeared, so we stopped supplying towels. I think they're home washing cars with them or doing something else. But it created that sense of family, because what does the private sector do? Look at all the major businesses. They got workout facilities. Some of them have healthcare facilities. They have all those things in them, so we did the same thing. We now have some very, very nice gyms that have no general fund dollars were spent. It was all money based on the classes we had, creating a business, and then creating within that business, the money has to go back into some form of education, training, and physical education. And again, you'll see that in a second. We have what we call Sacramento PD University. It's Moodle, and thank you to NPS because they helped us get it started. So we have forums and information out there. The same thing a private sector do is keeping the employees always up to speed on what's going on out there. So we've got classes online. We have our procedure manuals online. We have, how do you take the sergeant's test with sample videos. Everything you possibly can want that the private sector would do to invest in their employees. Moodle's free. I knew how to use it, so we started doing it. And thank you again to Kristen and the staff, because we basically came down with our IT staff, found out how to get it up and running, and used them for technical support to get it up and going. And then we gave an employee satisfaction survey. We took the Forbes magazine survey to the employees. We kind of changed the language and changed it up a little bit, and we did an employee satisfaction survey. So keep in mind, keep this number in mind, 79.7% of the employees, when they took the survey, saying they like coming to work. That's going to be important when you look at what we went through. So we wanted to find out what it was. And lastly, how many people have read the last lecture? Great book, by the way. I've read it 3 times. I think there's tremendous value in leadership lessons in the great lecture. And by the way, how many cops in the room? Some of you read it. It's a cop book. It's about this big, about that thick. The margins are about that wide, and it's got pictures in it. So it's a great cop book. So if the cops can do it, everybody else in the room can understand it as well, right? In it, I picked it up on the second read. In it, the professor who's giving the last lecture, and I won't tell you all about it, but I encourage you to read it. It's a very quick read. It's an airplane ride read. Don't watch the video until you've read the book at least twice. In it, the professor who's asked to give the last lecture like he's dying, right? Then he finds out he actually is dying. So he's going to give the last lecture when everybody knows he's terminally ill. And so he tells stories in there. And he's telling a story in his book about how he's having a conversation with a different professor. And he's talking about, we merged a class with all these people from different thought processes and disciplines, right? Similar to NPS. We're going to put a bunch of people in a room that come from different backgrounds. And he's explaining to a colleague of his how great it was. Everybody jumped over the bar. Man, they're just phenomenal. These people, I tell them what to do, and they're over the bar. And his colleague says, your bar's too low. Raise your bar. So he keeps raising his bar with the students. Then he finally gets to a point where the students are not successful at getting over the bar. But they're not successful because he's challenging them so much. He realizes, I have to give an award to people who try but are not successful. So he called it the Penguin Award. The Penguin Award is the first penguin that jumps into the water, determines whether the rest of them are going to get eaten or not. So who's got the guts to jump in the water to see who's going to get eaten or not? So we now have in the Sacramento Police Department, because most of us in this room, we give awards for heroism, we give rewards for success. We reward everybody for doing these great things. We never really reward someone who tried something and it didn't work. Private sector. Those of you with iPads, they didn't design the iPad the first try out. They kept over and over and over again. The private sector doesn't call it failure. They call it success by building on it. Government, we call it failure if you try something new and it doesn't work. So we went away from failure and went to the Penguin Award. Actually, that was in my performance objectives this last year, is that we implement a Penguin Award. I put that on my objectives. To reward people who are trying something new, because what's the worst thing happens if it doesn't work? It doesn't work. You keep doing it the way you were doing it. So we created a culture of trying something new in the organization. Again, a private sector approach. So out to the community, here's the asks that we had of the community, because we're back on the bring down crime, invest in our employees, now we're in great customer service. They basically want 4 things. How fast you pick up the phone, how fast you get to me, what are you doing with whatever you're doing with me, crime report, burglary report, whatever it is, and how do I get a copy of it. So we had 14 town hall meetings. Again, what would the private sector do? You go out to the customer, you do sampling. They do it all the time. Surveys and sampling for your customers. 14 town hall meetings, hard copy surveys and online surveys. Again, not everybody's online, so we handed them out at community meetings. We had town hall meetings. So with all that information, here's what we went through from 2007 to 2012, and there's now a tax initiative, so they're building back now. It was my job to tear it down, I guess. $41.7 million reduction in our budget. We lost 358 employees, 151 sworn. By the way, that reduction in employees makes us the second lowest staffed major city in the United States. I used to say the United States, UK, and Canada, but I haven't looked up the latest numbers with the UK because they're going through some issues there. So we are the second lowest staffed. Barney Melekian talked about Camden, New Jersey with their layoffs. Camden, New Jersey still has twice the staffing we do per capita, even after their 50% reduction. So we're the second lowest staffed major city. We eliminated basically all the specialty units, narcotics, gangs, vice, financial crimes, closed 3 of our 4 public counters. There's nothing left but patrol. Now, all those jobs, that work didn't go away. Just because you don't have a narcotics division doesn't mean you stop doing narcotics enforcement, or gangs, you stop doing gangs. We just shifted all that responsibility out to patrol. What also happened was when we eliminated those, senior detectives went back to patrol. We laid off the junior employees, which, by the way, was the hardest thing I've ever done in my career, was lay off people who, through no fault of their own, lost their jobs. But what happened is we had a very experienced patrol force that way, very experienced. The Cops program, the TV show Cops, came out. This is their 3rd time riding in the Sacramento Police Department. I took them out to lunch because they were so easy to work with. I bought them lunch to thank the film crew for just being nice and not getting in our way. And the senior film production guy says, I got to tell you, we've been filming for years. I've been doing this for 10 years all over the country. I've never seen an organization like yours. The sense of family, the fact that they're happy with what they do, and their experience level is just, there's nobody out there in the nation that matches it. Well, part of it, he knew it, part of it was these senior detectives are now back at patrol. So we got some very senior people. But given the fact that we went through all that, for him to say that there's a sense of family, people are happy with what they do, and the fact that they took concessions, pay cuts, laid people off, lost their jobs was absolutely amazing. And again, I credit back to a private sector approach. We kept asking ourselves, what would the private sector do if we're in that business? So here's the results that we had. You saw what happened, the reductions. Here's what we had. 21% reduction in our serious crime. Part 1 crimes down 21%. 23% reduction in our alcohol traffic collisions. Remember, we're number 1 in the state, now we're number 3. Went from number 1 to number 3. Property crime went from number 2 to number 4. 42% reduction in internal affairs complaints. Those are all the discourtesy complaints. For those of you in law enforcement, that's huge. And by the way, we take every complaint that's given to us. We don't screen them. The community complaints went almost in half on discourtesy. Internal complaints stayed the same, but the community complaints went down. Workers' comp costs, almost 42% reduction. Remember the health club thing I talked about? Our employees are getting hurt less, and when they do get hurt, they're coming back to work sooner. Because we're measuring those. Sick leave use per employee is down. Those are indications of a healthy organization. These are some of the indications of what the results were of that. And despite the fact that we've had all those issues, our 911 answering time went down. We didn't cut the comm center, and our answer times actually went down, which is a good thing, because we wanted to get it below that 10-second mark for us. So what are some of the takeaways? These are my always. Everyone in the executive command staff, all the EORs, retired out. Like EOR's got the paint room. By the way, nobody will follow EOR. Everybody notice that? Nobody wants to follow EOR. So everybody that stayed in the command staff, even though we did all this stuff, kept a positive attitude. I say paradise because every day was paradise at work. We talked about it every day. Everybody came in with a smile. The command staff was critical to that. Everybody had to be smiling, enjoying their job, and it became infectious. Supervisors having a good time, and that really helped us out. We stole it again from the nugget market. We did a lot of futures forecasting. What's going to happen way out in front? Everything that we did was, what's going to happen out in front? Let's get out in front of it along the way. I use this quick example, and then I'll be quiet. But, for all of you in the room, and I'm going to go back, especially the law enforcement folks, Clinton was known for putting 100,000 cops on the street, right? So when Clinton is reelected to his second term, what do we know for sure when Clinton's reelected to his second term? What's going to happen 4 years later? New president. Because Clinton's on his second term, he's out. What does each president do to the prior president? They try to gut whatever their legacy is. They don't want somebody in front of them to have this great legacy. So we knew when Clinton came to second term in our department, this is way back now, that somewhere there was going to be a significant change to the COPS program. Bush gets elected, September 11th occurs. That was our indicator that something was going to happen on the terrorism side, right? He hadn't stood up DHS. But much like LA Sheriff, we had one of the regional community policing institutes in California. There was one in Sacramento. We immediately started putting in terrorism training into that component before DHS ever got stood up. Okay? Bush, second term, gets reelected. What do we know for sure? We're going to get a new president in 4 years. What's one of his legacies? DHS. So we pretty much predicted that when Bush is out of office, that somewhere our Homeland Security funding is going to get squeezed. You also can predict that Biden was the senator who crafted the COPS legislation, so once you saw who was going to get it, you pretty much knew the COPS programs were going to come back. So we positioned our organization to withstand the cuts in the UASI on the Homeland Security and to ramp up for COPS monies. So what do we know for sure that's going to happen 4 years from now? We're going to get a different president. Look at the legacy programs that Obama's building around your field, and I guarantee you they're going to get scaled back. So we have 4 years now a window to look forward to, and that's what we've been doing in our organization along the way, including what's going on with the budget, what's going to happen, how the COPS office is responding, what the Attorney General is doing to kind of position our organization so we can get grants. And then we constantly look and feedback on assessing the goals. Are those 3 goals still valid? And if they're still valid, we got to live with them. Those are our goals, and they're still valid. Reduce serious crime, invest in your employees, and great customer service. And every employee knows that. What's interesting is we had different screensavers done. I showed you the one with the car on it. We had ones that had showed employees and family and doing all these things. But almost every picture that we had on the different screensavers, we rotated the screensavers through. The IT folks, they go in and do their magical stuff that they do because they can do it remotely. And then when we started laying people off, some of the people in pictures were the ones laid off. And so we got feedback, can you take that picture off because that person doesn't work here anymore. The one thing we did do on the layoffs is we laid people off, but they stayed in the family. We quickly created reserve classifications for every employee that got laid off, asked them if they wanted to stay. They weren't collecting a paycheck, but we didn't take their ID away from them, their key to the building, or their internet access or their access into our systems. because the private sector wouldn't do that. You got to treat them right as they're going out. They're still family members. Just because they got laid off doesn't mean that you just kick them out the door and forget about them. So we actually had some people that I ran into at a show one time. One of our young officers, she was laid off, and I saw her coming up at intermission, and I was with my wife, and I go, uh-oh. She goes, what? I go, that's one of the officers I laid off. And the officer came up, shook my hand, and said, I got to thank you. She goes, I'm going to wait. I'm not going to go to another agency. I want to come back to work here. So I'm going to wait as long as it takes to get back hired here, just because of the way she was treated on the way out the door. So there's a lot of other examples that we stole from the private sector. One of the major lessons to all of you is that when someone tells me in government that says that we can't do that, whether it's HR or procurement, because those are the two big ones, we make them prove, show me where it says we can't. Show me where it says we can't. Because most of the time, at least in our city, they can't show you where it says they can't. They just made up the rule decades ago, and that rule just still continues to exist. And so we're constantly challenging, because that's what the private sector would do. No, just, if there's a rule that doesn't make sense, they change the rule. In government, we set a rule, and if it doesn't make sense, we just keep digging ourselves deeper and deeper into that rule. We can change the rules. So that's kind of what we went through. Just some quick takeaways for you. One, thanks for your time. Answer any questions you might have, and move from there.